Here, how ought we understand philosophers who have heard the Buddha's teaching, but have interpreted it in their terms of philosophy rather than its own terms? I listened to some such philosophers speak of the Dharma, and while I have no doubt of their good intentions, they have come to some conclusions and notions that seem misguided at best, harmful and incorrect at worst.
This is an interesting question. We must be very careful in how we critique these thinkers. While many of them come to incorrect conclusions about the Buddha's teachings, it would be unfair to say that their entire philosophies are wrong or that they're bad philosophers. We must be specific and forgiving in how we address them, and it must clearly come from a spirit of collaboration.
That does seem the most compassionate way to go, more likely to be effective as well.
Indeed, there's no such duality as right or wrong. There are only differing interpretations that are, or are not, supported by different aspects of the teaching.
That being the case, while we may eventually move on from their interpretations, it should still be acknowledged that these thinkers did quite a lot of investigative work when it came to coming up with their philosophies. Furthermore, perhaps by examining where their interpretations go astray, we can learn something about their thought processes.
Exactly.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week, we will be discussing early Western scholarship on Buddhism. Who were some early Western scholars who shaped Western ideas about Buddhism? What were their perspectives and arguments? Where does scholarly consensus stand on those conversations and encounters today? We hope you enjoy. So let's get started. Who were some early Western scholars who shaped Western ideas about Buddhism?
For the purposes of this discussion, we'll be talking about three major figures: Arthur Schopenhauer, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Helena Blavatsky. To establish context, I'll give a little bit of explanation about the eras of European history that they lived in, and then I'll give a bit of background about each of them and discuss their engagements with Buddhism in scholarship and literature. Each had a different relationship with Buddhism, but their encounters were strongly influential on the development of European scholarship and then the subsequent English language scholarship on those materials and on Buddhism for years to come. Modern scholarship has become ever more critical of their arguments and perspectives, but they still form the early foundations of Buddhist scholarship in the West, even if it is just to demonstrate what people used to think and to see how far we've come. Before that, though, a word on how we evaluate research done in the past. Scholarly consensus is always evolving and building on itself. It isn't wrong or controversial to look at earlier stuff and say that it was inadequate, misguided, or biased in some way. For example, consider Charles Darwin and the idea of Darwinian evolution by means of natural selection. While Darwin's work was groundbreaking and extremely influential, there is plenty of well-renowned and widely accepted scholarship in the field of evolutionary biology that says, here is what Darwin got wrong, or here are data that challenge Darwinism and merit a reimagination of evolution and its mechanisms. That doesn't mean that modern biologists don't believe in evolution. It means that they have gone back and re-examined the work of their predecessors now that they have more data, better tools, better technology, and better methods for studying evolution. As a result, there are lots of pro-evolution people who are critical of the early work done by Darwin. The same can be applied to Buddhist scholarship. We have better resources for reading the texts in their original languages, we have a body of scholarly work in our own languages to build on, and we have more specific and targeted approaches to the material that older scholars like the three that we're discussing did not have. That doesn't mean that these scholars' work has been discarded entirely in academia, it just means that we've made good progress since they were around. Let's begin with Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer was born in 1788 in Gdansk, which is present-day Poland, but was then a part of the Kingdom of Prussia, and his parents were wealthy German patricians. Patrician is just another word for aristocracy or nobility, but it refers to the fact that these people were able to participate in political activities and governance during this era of Prussian history. He was educated at the University of Göttingen and the University of Berlin, receiving his PhD in 1813. He was originally a student of science and medicine, but he switched to philosophy in 1810 when he left the University of Göttingen. He is known for being an incredibly prolific philosopher. He was very active in the fields of metaphysics, aesthetics, ethics, morality, psychology, and more. He was known for his theory of perception, which argued that in order to make sense of the world around us, we need to have a pre-existing knowledge of causality. In other words, when we cognize sensory information that we receive into complete pictures of the world, we have to acknowledge that our sense organs are being caused to perceive what they perceive. In this, causation is not a result of observation, but is the very reason for perception itself. This, he argued, implied that the world was one of representations that are only organized and rendered intelligible in our minds. In that sense, the world is not objectively the way we perceive it to be. We engage in perception of things representing themselves in our minds, and that is what makes us think reality is the way it is. Building on this gap between how the world is and how it represents itself or is represented to us, he concludes that there must be an inner essence of reality that is beyond perception. This inner essence, he argues, is will, intention, or volition, and the object of that will is to exist. In other words, perceptions are the result of representations in our minds, and representations in our minds are the result of the will or intention of reality or of things in reality to present themselves. This is not sentient or conscious. It's simply a blind assertion or imposition of the will to exist. You can start to see how he might respect, acknowledge, and perhaps be influenced by Buddhist thinking as he came to these conclusions. His interpretations of Buddhist thinking influenced his other work, such as in his theory of aesthetics, wherein he bases his arguments on the position that desire is the cause of human suffering. We'll discuss those points more in detail in the next question. The academic environment in which Schopenhauer came up was just after the climax of the Enlightenment era.
Note that we use the word enlightenment here in the European sense, not the Buddhist sense.
In this time, scientific principles, empiricism, and rationalism took off in Europe. While this era was crucial for the development of academia as we know it, it was also very fraught as an age of scholarly history. Most scholars misapplied scientific principles to political and social contexts, resulting in a lot of pro-colonial and pro-imperial ideologies. For example, application of Darwin's ideas to human labor and ethics led to the idea of social Darwinism, which is very problematic. The Enlightenment era featured exploitation of laborers and workers and lots of pseudo-scholarly and pseudo-scientific thought. This was the age that led directly into the Industrial Revolution, but also into the expansionism of the European colonial powers. Pertinent to the discussion of Buddhism, it was an era wherein dangerous racial sciences and Orientalist thought came to the forefront of scholarship. Orientalism is a term referring to the scholarly and literary process of othering people from the Middle East and Asia. In fact, it is from this time and from this Orientalist thought process that we got the terms Middle East and Far East. In this time, all of world geography became centered and defined in relation to England. This process of othering took many, many forms. From a political and social perspective, it was the process of dehumanizing or inferiorizing peoples who were not white, Christian, and European as justification for colonizing them. There was a great deal of scholarly argument that African, Middle Eastern, and Asian societies were somehow less developed, less intelligent, and less resourceful than white Europeans, and that they needed to be civilized and modernized by Europeans, the so-called white man's burden. From the literary perspective, Orientalism romanticized these peoples as possessing ancient mystical secrets and knowledge and extravagant wealth, which again fueled the colonial fervor to go and steal those things. Stories of journeys into the quote-unquote savage Orient were incredibly popular as entertainment for European audiences. It wasn't just literature and politics either. There was an obsession for things they perceived to be exotic and foreign, or other to themselves, including music, commodities, foods, visual arts, and more. Keep this in mind as we continue the discussion of these scholars. Even to this very day, academia has not fully decolonized and overcome Orientalism. The next scholar we will discuss is Friedrich Nietzsche. He was born in the Kingdom of Prussia as well in 1844, to a long line of scholars and philosophers on his father's side. He began his career as a classical philologist. Philology is the branch of scholarship that deals with the structure, historical development, and relationships of a language or languages. It's different from linguistics because rather than dealing with the construction of grammar, script, sound, or change in these things over time, it deals directly and specifically with language in the context of textual sources. In other words, instead of tracing the development of the English alphabet from the ancient Phoenician by using numerous texts and archaeological sources like a linguist, philologists examine and make arguments on how the particular structure of a sentence or passage in a text implies meaning. Later in his career, Nietzsche famously became a philosopher of aesthetics, ethics, metaphysics, ontology, philosophy of history, religion, and more. He was known for his nihilistic philosophy and his God is dead contention. He was a nihilist in that he thought that ethical and religious contentions on morality were ultimately arbitrary and pointless, and only existed to give a foundation of meaning and feeling to reality. He contended that religious thought attempts to objectivize the world, to contend that an objective truth exists and is possible, and that that objective truth is God, or religious realization, or religious morality. However, he argued, critical thinking, observation, science, and materialism has shown that no such objectivity exists, and thus has killed God. He did not write extensively on Buddhism, but his nihilistic perspectives were strongly influential on the scholarly contention that Buddhism is an inherently nihilist religious tradition. The final scholar we will be discussing is not really even a scholar, but her name is Helena Blavatsky. She was a writer and a self-proclaimed mystic born in Russia in 1831 to wealthy parents, and she was mostly self-educated. She allowed her interests to guide what she read and did, and in her early life, she developed a strong interest in Western esotericism. Western esotericism refers to traditions of ritual and study which center around secret, hidden, or concealed knowledge that is attainable either through the Abrahamic religions, as in the case of Kabbalah, or through non-Abrahamic paths, such as Hermeticism and alchemy. And this is all centered on Europe and the Americas. She wrote that in her studies of Western esotericism, she concluded that there is this group of spiritual adepts and sages called the Masters of Ancient Wisdom, and that they possessed and transmitted ancient secrets and knowledge to people who trained with them. This knowledge was supposedly a grand unified theory of everything that synthesized religion, science, philosophy, and more into a singular truth that transcended all. She claimed to have traveled the world seeking out and training with these masters, but much of this was likely made up. It's hard to tell what she wrote for entertainment and what was part of a grift that capitalized on Western people's increasing interest in non-Christian ways of thinking and that which they believed to be exotic, and this whole Orientalist idea of ancient Eastern secrets. But it's fairly certain that she never went to many of the places that she claimed to have gone to, and that many of the masters of ancient wisdom she claimed to meet or hear about simply were not real. She was known for having founded Theosophy, forms of philosophical or religious thought based on a mystical insight into the divine nature of the universe, in the US in the late 1880s. She claims that she founded it not as a religion, but as a philosophical and scholarly group for the transmission and study of, quote-unquote, the once universal religion, or the grand unified theory that I mentioned earlier. In modern times, many scholars argue that this was an occultist new religious movement verging on a cult, centered around Helena Blavatsky herself. I don't want to give too much airtime to her arguments because they've been proven to be incorrect, plagiarized, or outright false, but I bring her into this discussion because one of her alleged masters of ancient wisdom was a Tibetan Buddhist, whom she probably falsely claimed to have visited and studied with. Her writing and the Theosophy group proved incredibly influential on the spread of Buddhism and Buddhist thought in America. We'll talk more about her particular perspectives in the next question.
What were their perspectives and arguments?
I picked these three scholars to talk about because they represent the original agents of three particular aspects of Western misimaginations of Buddhism that persist to this day. Schopenhauer brought with him the idea that Buddhism is incredibly pessimistic, yet still empirical and scientific. Nietzsche brought with him the idea that Buddhism is nihilistic, world-negating, and self-negating. Blavatsky brought with her the idea that Buddhism contains ancient and mystical secrets, a perfect synthesis of science, philosophy, and religion that can be the object of one's spirituality, even while they were religiously Christian or whatever else. We will develop each of these claims more in context here. I mentioned that Schopenhauer had his theories of reality as will and representation, containing inner essence. In developing these theories, he engaged with Buddhism directly. He argued that human behavior is inherently trapped by will, the blind assertion for continued existence, and that this leads to suffering in life. We want, and because we want, we strive, and striving is difficult, unpleasant, and ultimately pointless, because attaining what we strive for does not stop our striving, because the result is fleeting, unfulfilling, or otherwise not substantially or permanently useful. Thus, the solution to suffering in life, Schopenhauer argues, is to break free of this will or tranquilize will itself through ascetic practices of self-negation that lead to something like ego death. This borrows strongly from Buddhist thought, of which Schopenhauer was a huge admirer. He saw Buddhism as empirical in its investigation of reality, coming to the same conclusions that he did. However, this misunderstands one important portion of Buddhist doctrine. Desire does not lead to suffering. It leads to dukkha. Dukkha can cause suffering, but it really indicates the insubstantiality and the impermanence of sensory indulgences, the impossibility of ever truly fulfilling one's desires. However, Schopenhauer's view that Buddhism sees all life as suffering and is thus pessimistic has taken off in the West and persisted even to this day. It also views Buddhism as very scientific in its investigation, which we will develop further in talking about Nietzsche. So let's do that. Nietzsche was actually an admirer and critic of Schopenhauer's work, and he agreed that Buddhism was very empirical and scientific in its investigation of reality. He claimed that it fostered critical thought and that it was not subject to the same problems as Abrahamic religions. In other words, God was not necessarily dead for Buddhists, because the Buddha is not necessarily a god, nor does he attempt to or claim to centralize all objective truth under his purview. The Buddha argues that one exists, but in Nietzsche's view, this truth was accessed by critical investigation from the individual, and thus represented a breakdown of objectivism as indicated in his own nihilistic arguments. This led to an idea that all ascetic activity was a will towards nothingness. Since he argued the death of God implied a breakdown of objectivism, he similarly argued that all religious exertion was aimed at an experience of de-individualization, shutting down your will to exist. This got misaligned with his respect for Buddhism, and so there exists this idea in the West, particularly among critics of Buddhism and of Nietzsche, that it is a borderline suicidal push toward complete non-existence. There's a misinterpretation of nirvana among Westerners, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, and their critics included, that it is a complete state of non-existence. While it is true that nirvana implies that you no longer arise in samsara, it can't be non-existence, because in Buddhism, nothing exists in a substantial and unchanging fashion in the first place. There's no dichotomy between existence and non-existence. Eternal non-existence contradicts impermanence just as much as eternal existence. Instead, nirvana is extinguishing the flames of desire, passion, greed, anger, hate, etc., and thus preventing those things from causing dukkha and causing one to have the momentum necessary to continue to arise in samsara. Moving on to Blavatsky. If you can't tell, I really don't like her. I think she was a liar and a grifter. She saw that Buddhism has an esoteric tradition, and she lumped that tradition in together with all other forms of esotericism, even though they're all very different. She created a narrative around these esoteric traditions that was vague and contradictory. She argued that they possessed and transmitted a singular, universal, and lost form of secret knowledge, but gave vague, contradictory, or nonsensical presentations of what that knowledge actually was. However, her relationship with Henry Steele Olcott, the first American Buddhist convert, who will get his own episode one day, was formative for Buddhism's propagation in the U.S. Being that it was filtered through this theosophist thought, it arrived as this mystical, semi-religious, and synthetic alternative or supplement to Abrahamic religions. I blame Blavatsky and Olcott for this idea in the West that Buddhism is just a philosophy or a way of life, instead of being a religion, and for perpetuating an existing conception that Buddhism and other Asian religions are all about the pursuit of ancient secrets and knowledge. It all is the foundation of this very self-helpy view of Buddhism that's just not really true or based on the facts.
Where does scholarly consensus stand on those conversations and encounters today?
Many scholars doubt that Schopenhauer read about Buddhism extensively because there was a lack of reliable translated sources during his lifetime. He wouldn't have had much to draw on, and what little he did would have been very biased and/or based on poorly translated text. They also contend that he co-opted Buddhism after discovering it existed, only to offer credibility to his philosophies. He's even quoted as having said the following, quote, "If I wished to take the results of my philosophy as the standard of truth, I should have to concede to Buddhism preeminence over the others. In any case, it must be a pleasure to me to see my doctrine in such close agreement with a religion that the majority of men on earth hold as their own, for Buddhism numbers far more followers than any other. And this agreement must be yet the more pleasing to me, inasmuch as in my philosophizing, I have certainly not been under its influence, for up until 1818, when my work appeared, there was to be found in Europe only a very few accounts of Buddhism." Unquote. I don't know where he got this idea that Buddhism and its adherents number far more than the Abrahamic religions. That's just simply not true. Also, here, he freely admits that there wasn't much to read about Buddhism, and so it looks increasingly like he brought Buddhism into his argumentation later, after he published all of his work on the philosophy of will and representation. Similarly, untranslating dukkha as suffering has been an ongoing process in Buddhism scholarship for nearly 200 years, and challenging Schopenhauer has always been a part of that. We should also mention the idea that Buddhism is nihilistic, which begins in part with Friedrich Nietzsche. We have discounted this on other episodes of the show, but this is a fundamental misunderstanding of Buddhism, and is somewhat connected to the idea that Buddhism is pessimistic. Nihilism is not as simple as it seems as a concept. There are several types of nihilism, including existential nihilism, moral nihilism, metaphysical nihilism, and more. We colloquially say that it means that life has no point or purpose, but in more specific terms, it is the argument that there is no extrinsic or intrinsic significance, meaning, value, path to truth, or realization of truth to be had by any means, whether that means is moral exertion, religious pursuit, or what have you. This view looks at existentialist and moral philosophies and says, you can think what you want, but none of these arguments actually result in cosmic, spiritual, or existential impact. Some have looked to later Pure Land Buddhism, which argues that our moral exertions from our own power are pointless, and that we are saved by the grace of Amida Buddha. And they've said that this is nihilistic. But the truth is, no form of Buddhism is nihilist. I'm not trying to be unduly defensive or biased towards Buddhism in saying this. It just fundamentally does not fit into the scheme or the definition of nihilism. The doctrines of karma, enlightenment, and nirvana fundamentally contradict nihilism. Nietzsche and Schopenhauer's contentions that Buddhism is scientific and empirical in its investigations of reality have also been challenged or disproven as well. For more on that, I recommend episode 14, What is the Relationship Between Buddhism and Science? Link in the show notes. Moving on to Blavatsky. Today she is seen as a new religious movement founding figure, rather than a scholar or philosopher, and so most of the criticism aimed at her has been on the grounds that she plagiarized or falsified her writing, rather than critiquing Theosophy as a worldview. That would be more personal and subjective than academia can really get, while maintaining credibility and professionalism. However, many scholars critique all Western occultist new religious movements and cults because, more often than not, they are very harmful and exploitive of their members, and many serve as pipelines to white supremacy, ultra-conservatism, and other harmful racial, social, and political ideologies. In summary, while these people have all contributed to now debunked perspectives on Buddhism, they are all still looked upon fairly neutrally, with the exception of Blavatsky. Many early European scholars on Buddhism have been looked upon as doing the best with what they had. They existed in particular contexts which have since changed. This is not an excuse to be uncritical and forgiving of harmful ideologies, but it does help discount an idea that we modern people frequently unconsciously have, which is the idea that people in the past were overall less intelligent and more ignorant than we are now. In other words, it's easy and satisfying to our egos to say, wow, people in the Dark Ages were so stupid, they thought illness was an invasion of the body by evil spirits. The response that we should have is, well, they didn't have microscopes, they didn't have germ theory, they didn't have antibiotics, they didn't have any of the material we have. We can't say that they were wrong and that we are right. They were just working in a different intellectual context with less information and resources than we have now. This holds true for all of the scholars we've discussed today.
I want to note that, excluding Blavatsky, I see the connections between what we've studied on the show and the misconceptions of these scholars. The Buddha presented his core ideas in a way that a non-religious person can still follow and resonate with. For example, reducing dissatisfaction by reducing desire makes sense outside of a religious context. The space between meditating for 40 days and spending a long time thinking empirically about how the world works is not that far. It's understandable that Nietzsche interpreted escaping the cycle of reincarnation as non-existence. These are misconceptions, but they're understandable ones, especially from the context they were working in.
They absolutely are, and that's why I advocate so much for being kind to them in hindsight, where appropriate. Biased and misguided and underserved with textual resources as they were, they clearly admired what they saw in Buddhism, and they didn't have explicit ill will in coming to their conclusions about it. Furthermore, our cultural and scholarly tastes and proclivities change over time. If you made a case to a scholar 100 years ago that there would be entire academic departments and subfields of academic disciplines focused on things we focus on in academia today, like gender and sexuality, computer science, or colonial studies, then they wouldn't have believed you, or they would have written it off as stupid and pointless, because they didn't care about those things then, and we do now. In 100 years, scholars will look back on us critically, and we should hope that they will give us the benefit of the doubt where appropriate as well.
We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion on early Western scholarship of Buddhism. Join us next week where we will be discussing the Saffron Revolution of 2007. What was the Saffron Revolution of 2007? What were the circumstances that caused it? What is its legacy? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
We'll see you next time. Thank you for listening. If you like our show and you want to financially support it, we ask that you instead send that generosity to support a worthy cause. For now, we ask that you support victims of the floods that struck Central Texas in early July. As of this recording, there are nearly 120 people confirmed dead, with over 170 people still missing. We've included a link to GoFundMe pages in our show notes. If you can, please join us in helping these people recover from this tragedy. Thank you. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Dogs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.